Her husband cheated. His mistress got pregnant. But when the wife showed up, pregnant too, at the other woman's baby shower, what happened next shocked everyone. A public confrontation, a violent shove, a courtroom drama with twin babies, betrayal, and a mother's unshakable love. This isn't just a story, it's a battle for dignity, truth, and a child's future. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that prove healing is always possible. They say you don't recognize the beginning of a disaster until it's too late. But I remember the exact moment I met Derek Collins, because for one brief evening, I thought he might just save me from myself. It was a fundraiser in West Hollywood, something glossy and over-catered, filled with people who used the word branding like it meant something sacred. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd been filling in for a sick friend, sipping on cucumber water and trying to avoid the photographers when I saw him. Derek, tall, sharply dressed, and talking to a group of older lawyers like he'd already conquered the world. He caught my eye as if it were scripted, smiled like we shared a secret, and just walked over like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Don't you hate these things?" he said. It wasn't the line, it was the way he said it, like we were already in on some private joke. I laughed. A real laugh. And it had been a long time since I'd felt that spark, that flutter deep in my stomach reminding me I was still capable of wanting someone. We found a corner and started talking. Not just surface chatter either. Real things. He asked about my work, and when I told him I was an interior designer specializing in restoring historic homes, he didn't fake interest. He leaned in and asked questions. He told me he'd just started working at his father's boutique law firm, focusing on family law of all things. I remember thinking, well, there's a man who wants to make the world a little less broken. He was 4 years older than me, and it showed in the way he moved, confident, deliberate, already a man with a plan. And me? I was 34, independent to a fault, coming off 2 years of emotional hibernation after a breakup that had gutted me. I wasn't looking for anyone, but Derek had that kind of magnetic pull that made you forget your reasons. He texted me the next day. Not something lazy like, hey. It was, Madeline, I found this little bistro in Echo Park that has your name all over it. Friday? And I went, and then I went again and again. Before I knew it, we were inseparable. Dinners that turned into weekends, late-night calls, and Sunday mornings in my kitchen with jazz humming under the clatter of coffee mugs. At first, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me. Really saw me. He was driven, but generous. Polished, but with a goofy streak that came out after his second glass of wine. He'd kiss my forehead when he thought I was asleep. He knew how to hold a conversation and my hand at the same time. And he always made me feel like the room got warmer when I walked into it. Within 6 months, he'd moved into my apartment. It was fast, I know. But when you've been alone long enough, love feels like a lifeline you don't dare question. He brought his espresso machine and law books. I cleared a shelf for him and ignored the gnawing fear that maybe I was moving too fast. I remember the day we started talking about marriage. We were watching some old black and white movie where the couple ran through a train station in the rain, and he turned to me and said, "I want a life with you, Madeline, not a season, a whole life." I melted. I wasn't naive. I'd just spent years building a life on my own. I'd been cautious, but Derek made me want to gamble. We got married the following year in a garden ceremony behind an old Spanish villa in Malibu. String lights, jazz quartet, my best friend Lucy flying in from Ohio with tears in her eyes as she watched me walk down the aisle. I wore a vintage lace dress I'd found in a consignment shop and altered myself. Derek looked like every dream I'd ever had in a navy blue suit. His eyes locked on me like I was the only woman in the world. And for a while, it felt like I was. The first few months of marriage were magic. Honeymoon mornings, shared grocery lists, slow dancing in the living room after long days. He'd still work late, but he'd bring home flowers or surprise me with wine and takeout. Building our future, he'd say with a grin, one court case at a time. But slowly, those little gestures faded. His phone was always buzzing. He started sleeping on the couch, saying he didn't want to wake me when he got home. I told myself it was the stress. The firm was demanding. His father, from what I'd seen, was an overbearing perfectionist. I wanted to be supportive, so I made our home a sanctuary. I designed the nursery before I was even pregnant, painted the walls a soft sage green, chose curtains that danced in the breeze. I told myself this was how we built something, through the quiet work, the small sacrifices. Then the day came when the pregnancy test turned positive. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding it like it was a miracle. I ran into the kitchen where he was reading case files and blurted it out. "Derek, I'm pregnant." He looked up, smiled, hugged me, said all the right things, but something in his eyes didn't move, like he was watching his life rearrange itself behind glass. Still, I clung to hope. I thought once the idea settled in, he'd change. He'd step up, be present. But instead, his late nights became later, his excuses thinner. I'd lie awake listening to the silence between his breaths and wonder when I'd stopped being enough. And then, of course, came the dreams. The ones where I was walking down a long hallway, calling for him, but he never turned around. If I'd known then what was really happening, who was really sharing his attention, I might have saved myself the heartbreak. But instead, I just loved him harder. Sent him ultrasound photos during his meetings, left little notes in his briefcase, cooked his favorite meals. I kept reaching for the version of him I first met. The problem was, that man wasn't coming home anymore. And the worst part, I still wasn't ready to let go. Because when you've poured your soul into someone, you don't want to believe they're not holding it carefully. You want to believe they're just tired, just distracted, just going through something. But deep down, I think I already knew. I just didn't know how far he'd already gone. There's something cruel about silence when you're in love with someone. Not the kind that's peaceful, like watching the ocean roll in from your porch, but the kind that feels like you're shouting into a canyon and all you get back is the echo of your own voice. After the excitement of the pregnancy announcement faded, that silence began to stretch between me and Derek like a rope pulling taut. I still believed he was overwhelmed. I kept telling myself that his long hours were noble, that he was working for us. But what used to be thoughtful check-ins during the day turned into unread texts. How did the appointment go? Would sit marked as delivered, unanswered, while I sat in the OB office alone, pressing my palm against the faint movement in my belly and pretending I wasn't scared. At home, I nested. I washed tiny onesies, organized diapers, alphabetized baby books. It gave me a sense of control, because nothing else made sense. Derek would come home late, loosen his tie, kiss my forehead absently like a man clocking into a routine, and collapse on the couch without asking how I was feeling. I'd tell him about a new prenatal craving, or that the baby kicked, and he'd nod, eyes glazed over. His mouth would say, "That's amazing," but his body was already reaching for the TV remote. I clung to every scrap of attention. One night, I wore a silky robe and lit candles just to feel like a wife again, not just a vessel waiting to burst. He walked in, looked startled, and mumbled something about being exhausted. I laughed it off, said I understood. But inside, I felt like I was disappearing. The nights he didn't come home until 2 or 3 in the morning were the worst. I'd wake up to the sound of the key turning, my body instinctively bracing, half hoping he'd crawl into bed and hold me like he used to, half dreading whatever lie he'd feed me. When I'd ask where he'd been, he'd say, "We had a last-minute filing," or "Bianca needed help with a court brief." Bianca. That name started to crawl under my skin. He'd brought her up in passing, a new paralegal at the firm, bright, ambitious. Nothing I hadn't been once. The way he said her name, though, was different. Effortless, familiar, like she lived somewhere closer than I did in his mind. I asked once, offhand, if she was working late every night, too. He shrugged. "She's just a kid trying to prove herself." And I believed him, or at least I tried to. I remember one afternoon, a rare moment when Derek was home early. I was folding baby clothes, humming something soft, and I looked over at him. He was on the couch, scrolling his phone, smiling, this little private smirk. I hadn't seen him smile like that in weeks. My heart leapt for a second until I realized it wasn't for me. He was texting someone. I asked who. He looked up startled. "Just work," he said, placing the phone face down on the coffee table. That was the moment I knew. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't proof. It was that quiet shift in a room when the truth settles in like dust. I felt it in my chest like a bruise starting to form. I tried to pretend I didn't. I made his favorite dinner that night: rosemary chicken, garlic mashed potatoes. He said thank you without tasting it. My eyes welled up when I did the dishes, but I blamed the hormones. Lucy called from Ohio the next day. "Is Derek around?" she asked cheerfully. I paused. "He's at work," I said. It was always the same lie. She never said it out loud, but I could hear it in her silence, that protective sister-like instinct kicking in. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. I said I was. I wasn't. By the time I reached the third trimester, the weight I was carrying wasn't just the baby. It was the grief of a marriage already starting to rot, and yet I was still trying to hold it all together with duct tape and baby powder. I still left sticky notes in his briefcase: "Don't forget to eat, you'll be a great dad." I still played the part of the hopeful wife, even though inside, my heart felt like it was bleeding out. One night, I couldn't sleep. The baby was kicking like crazy, like she sensed my restlessness. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of warm milk like my grandmother used to do. I glanced over at Derek's phone, sitting unattended on the countertop. Something inside me broke. We'd always respected each other's privacy. It was a silent rule, something we held up like a gold standard of trust. But what happens when the person who's supposed to guard your heart becomes the reason it's broken? His passcode was his birthday. I knew it. He hadn't changed it in years. My fingers trembled as I typed it in. The screen lit up. Messages, dozens of them, threads with Bianca. At first, it was just the casual banter. "Great job today. You saved me in that deposition." But it quickly shifted. "Last night was amazing. You always know how to calm me down." And then, worse: "I can't stop thinking about the way you smell. I wish I could wake up next to you every day." I dropped the phone. My hands shook so violently, I thought I might throw up. The room tilted, the floor threatened to rise up and swallow me. And then I felt a kick. Our baby, reminding me she was there. Still growing, still waiting. I clutched my stomach and whispered, "I'm sorry." When Derek came out of the shower, towel slung around his waist, humming some old Motown song, I was waiting. Sitting at the kitchen table, his phone beside me like a detonated bomb. He froze when he saw me. His eyes darted to the phone. He knew. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just looked at him and said, "How long?" He blinked, stunned. "It's not, Madeline. It's not what you think." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "How long?" He sat down slowly, ran a hand through his damp hair. "It just happened." "You tripped and fell into her bed?" I laughed, but it was hollow. "That's rich." "I was lonely," he said quietly. "You've been so focused on the baby." My breath caught. "Don't you dare blame this on her. On me." He reached for my hand. I pulled back like he was poison. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered, and yet it had. While I was buying bassinets and prenatal vitamins, he was building a secret life. While I dreamed of the moment he'd hold our daughter, he was holding someone else. I didn't sleep in the same bed that night. I lay awake in the guest room, my hands wrapped around my belly like armor. Tears burned my cheeks. Every sob felt like another piece of me tearing loose. By morning, Derek was knocking at the door. "Let me explain," he begged. "We can fix this." But there was no we anymore. Something had cracked open, and there in the wreckage I saw the truth. The man I married was gone, and the woman left behind had a baby coming. She didn't have time to break. She had to become steel. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral. No flowers, no casseroles from concerned neighbors. No one stopping you in the grocery store with a soft, "I'm sorry for your loss." But make no mistake, when your marriage dies while you're still in it, when the man sleeping down the hall is a stranger wearing your husband's skin, it's a funeral of the soul. And I was mourning quietly every single day. After that night, the night I saw everything laid bare in Derek's phone, nothing was ever the same. He tried, in his own way. Or maybe he just pretended. He brought home flowers, the same supermarket bouquet I'd once loved when we first started dating. He ordered takeout from my favorite Indian place. He ran baths and said we needed to reconnect. But the petals fell too fast. The curry tasted like guilt. And the tub just made me feel more alone. He said he'd stopped seeing her, that it had meant nothing. It was a mistake, Madeline. I was stressed. I was stupid. I know that now. I didn't know what was worse, believing him or not believing him. At night, I lay in bed with my hand on my stomach, feeling Eliza twist and kick. That baby was the only thing grounding me, The only evidence that I wasn't invisible. Her heartbeat was the sound of defiance. I wasn't alone. Not entirely. I had her. Lucy came to visit. She flew in from Ohio with a suitcase full of herbal tea and unsolicited advice. She barely waited to hug me before launching into questions. Are you staying with him? I don't know. You deserve better than this, Maddie. You know that, right? I'm scared, I whispered. I don't want to raise a child alone. She nodded, eyes softening. But is being with him really less lonely than being alone? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. Derek agreed to go to therapy. We went to one session together. He was charming, articulate, remorseful, just like he was in court. He knew how to say the right things. He teared up at the right moments. But when the therapist asked him if he was still in contact with Bianca, he hesitated for just 1 second too long. That hesitation told me everything. Later that night, when he went to the store to grab milk, I picked up his tablet. He'd synced it to his phone, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that the messages would show up. There they were. Still talking, still sweet-talking, still meeting. She'd sent him a picture of her ultrasound. I stared at the image of that tiny, blurry form and my chest seized. It was real. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was biology. Another baby, another life, growing right alongside mine. I didn't cry, not right away. I sat frozen, watching the screen until it went black, until I saw my reflection staring back at me. Hollow-eyed, pale, but no longer in denial. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I didn't even throw the tablet, though God knows I wanted to. I simply turned it off, walked into the nursery I'd been building, and sat down in the rocking chair. That night, I drafted an email to my OB, asking for recommendations on doulas and therapists who specialized in postpartum trauma. Because I knew what was coming. I could feel the storm gathering. The next morning, I asked Derek to leave. He refused. This is my home too, Maddie. No, I said, my voice calm. It used to be. Now it's a crime scene. He slept on the couch. I locked the bedroom door. We became ghosts haunting the same square footage. And then came the phone call. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. But something, maybe intuition, maybe pain wearing a new face, told me to pick up. Is this Madeline Hayes? A soft voice asked. Yes. This is Carmen Blake. I'm Bianca's sister. My body stiffened. The name hit me like cold water. She hesitated. I know this is strange. I didn't want to call you, but I think you have a right to know. To know what? Bianca's pregnant. She's, well, far along, about 6 months. I pressed my hand to my stomach instinctively. Carmen's voice wavered. There's a baby shower this weekend. Bianca invited Derek. She says he promised to come. The words didn't feel real, like someone else's life, someone else's heartbreak. I thought, if it were me, I'd want to know, Carmen said gently. I'm sorry. I thanked her somehow, hung up, then sat perfectly still until my legs tingled from disuse. I stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. It sounded deranged. Derek hadn't told me. Of course he hadn't. I was just the wife, just the woman carrying his other child. I made a decision that day. I wasn't going to sit back and watch him lie his way through this. I wasn't going to let him waltz into a celebration of his affair child while pretending to be a decent man. So I picked out a dress, simple, loose-fitting, the kind that moved with the wind and gave nothing away. I curled my hair. I applied lipstick like war paint, and I went. The baby shower was in the hills above LA, at a picture-perfect barn draped in pastel bunting and floral centerpieces. It looked like something out of a lifestyle blog, the kind of place where lies go to masquerade as love. I arrived without warning, walked past the valet, climbed the gravel path alone. I spotted Derek's car immediately, and then I saw him, standing next to Bianca, hand on the small of her back, laughing at something. He looked relaxed, happy. He didn't see me at first, but others did. Coworkers, friends of friends, people who knew exactly who I was and what I represented. A few gasped, others froze, and then Derek turned. Our eyes met. His face drained of color. He moved toward me like a man stumbling through a dream. What are you doing here? He hissed, grabbing my arm. You shouldn't be here. I pulled away. Don't touch me. Bianca approached, all grace and condescension. Maybe we can speak outside? No, I said, loud enough to quiet the room. We'll talk here. You invited the father of my child. I assume you don't mind having me around too. A silence fell over the room, the kind that crackles with electricity. Carmen stood in the corner, white-faced, her guilt written all over her. Derek's grip tightened on my arm. "You're making a scene," he snapped. I yanked free. "No, Derek. You made this scene the moment you decided to live two lives." And then it happened. He shoved me. Not a tap, not a push to guide me toward the door. He shoved me. My feet stumbled back, crashing into a table of frosted cupcakes. My back hit the edge hard. Pain burst through me. A hand flew to my belly. Gasps filled the room. Bianca looked horrified. Guests surged forward. Carmen ran to me. I waved her off. I stood tall, hand still on my stomach, eyes locked on Derek. "You don't get to hurt me and still pretend to be a father," I said, voice trembling. Then I walked out. Not once did I look back. Not at the guests, not at Bianca, not at the man I had once married. I walked out of that barn with a spine made of steel and a promise blooming in my chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hours after the baby shower felt like a dream I couldn't wake up from. Except it wasn't a dream, and the bruise forming along my spine reminded me exactly how real it had been. I spent the night in the hospital, strapped to a fetal monitor, lying in a room that smelled like antiseptic and broken illusions. The baby was fine, thank God. Eliza's heartbeat thumped, steady and strong, defiant as ever. But I wasn't. Not really. Lucy was the first to call. She had already seen the posts, cryptic whispers from guests who'd been too stunned to keep it to themselves. Pregnancy drama. Some men have zero shame. She showed up like a storm in heels. The internet did what the internet always does, fed off chaos like vultures over a carcass. I didn't care about the comments. I cared about the silence that followed. The silence from Derek. No call, no apology, nothing but a gaping hole where a husband should have been. When Lucy finally got through, she was crying. I could hear her pacing. "Maddie, you have to press charges. He put his hands on you. That's assault." I just closed my eyes. "I don't want to talk about it. But you can't let him get away with this." "I'm not," I whispered. "I'm going to court. But I'm doing it my way." And I meant it. The next day I contacted a lawyer, Teresa Grant. She came recommended by another designer I knew, a woman who had survived her own ugly divorce and lived to tell about it. Teresa didn't sugarcoat anything. She met me in her office, took one look at the swelling along my back, and said, "We'll file for a protective order immediately. And Madeline, we're not going to let him walk all over you." I didn't cry during that meeting. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't cry until I sat in Eliza's half-finished nursery, looked at the tiny crib I had painted pale yellow, and realized I might be bringing her home to a world that was anything but safe. Then the envelope arrived. Thick, official-looking, bearing the county's seal. A summons. Derek, through his father's firm, of course, was petitioning the court for a custody and visitation hearing. For a child that wasn't even born yet. I stared at the papers like they were written in another language. My hands trembled. My heart raced. The audacity. After pushing me, after lying, after shattering every piece of trust I had left, he wanted to play the father now, preemptively? I called Lucy. She was silent for a moment, then muttered, "He's trying to flip the narrative. He's scared you'll file assault charges, so now he wants to make you look unstable, emotional, pregnant, and irrational." I knew she was right, and it lit a fire inside me I didn't know I had left. Teresa agreed. "We'll countersue for protection. And I want you to start documenting everything. Photos, witness statements, medical records. Don't leave a single thing out. The courts don't just believe pain, they need proof." So I gathered proof. Carmen, bless her, was the first to offer a written statement. So did 3 guests from the baby shower. One even had a photo, blurry, caught mid-push, but unmistakable. And then, a week before the hearing, came the twist. I was sitting on my couch, watching reruns of a home renovation show I used to love but now barely registered, when the call came. It was the receptionist at Teresa's office. "There's been a development," she said. "Bianca Reed has requested to attend the hearing." I blinked. "Why?" "She says it concerns the welfare of her children." Children. Plural. I felt the room spin for a moment, and then I exhaled, long and slow. Of course. Twins. The day of the hearing arrived like a thunderstorm. I wore black, a maternity dress that hugged my bump like armor. Teresa met me in the courthouse parking lot, calm and composed. "You ready?" she asked. "No," I said honestly. "But I'm here." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pew-like benches, fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale. Derek sat across from me in a navy suit, flanked by his father. He wouldn't look at me. I didn't need him to. Then the doors burst open. Gasps rippled through the room as Bianca entered, pale and exhausted, cradling a newborn in her arms. Behind her was an older woman, Angela Reed, carrying another car seat with a second infant inside. Twins. Premature, fragile, swaddled in pale blue. The judge, a stern woman named Regina Martin, called for silence. Angela stepped forward. "Your Honor, these are Bianca's babies. Carter Collins is their father. He signed the paperwork at the hospital." Derek stood slowly. "They gave me papers while she was in labor." "I didn't." Judge Martin cut him off. "Are you confirming paternity or not, Mr. Collins?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." It was like watching a slow implosion. Over the next hour, the court heard everything. Witness testimonies. The hospital report from my ER visit. Derek's messages to Bianca. The judge's face remained unreadable, but I saw her jaw clench when she asked, "Did you physically push your pregnant wife at another woman's baby shower?" Derek tried to spin it. "I was de-escalating a scene." The judge leaned in. "By pushing a pregnant woman?" Silence. Bianca, to her credit, didn't defend him. She stood shaking and said, "We made a mistake, but the twins are innocent. They need stability." When it was my turn, I stood slowly. Every nerve screamed, but I looked the judge in the eye and said, "I'm not here to destroy anyone. I just want to protect my child. I want her safe. I want peace. That's all." The judge nodded once. "Miss Hayes, I'm granting an emergency protective order. Mr. Collins is to have no physical contact with you until further notice. All communication regarding the child will go through your attorney. Visitation, if any, will be supervised." I felt my knees weaken, but I stayed upright. She turned to Derek. "You will begin anger management classes immediately. Custody arrangements for the twins will be determined pending further review." Teresa placed a hand on my back as I exhaled. The hearing ended not with an explosion, but with a quiet bang of the gavel. But the echo of it felt seismic. Outside the courtroom, Bianca approached me slowly. She looked wrecked. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the tiny baby in her arms, eyes still shut tight against the world. Then I said softly, "I hope you do better for them than he did for us." She nodded, tears welling. "I will." I walked away then, past the photographers, past the whispering crowd, past the man I had once loved who now looked like he didn't even recognize his own reflection. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. The courthouse faded behind me, but the weight of everything that had happened didn't. It followed me home like an invisible cloak, heavy, suffocating, woven from betrayal and legal jargon and images I couldn't erase. Derek flinching under Judge Martin's scrutiny, Bianca clutching one of the twins with tears streaking down her face, and those two newborns, fragile, undeserving of the chaos they'd been born into. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought walking out of that courtroom with the protective order in hand would feel like a win. But it didn't. Not really. It felt like I had survived a war, but one I never volunteered to fight. In the days that followed, my body moved, but my spirit lagged behind. I kept my calendar light, opting out of projects that once would have excited me. I watched the light move across the baby's room and wondered how I'd fill it with hope when all I could feel was dread. Eliza was due in a few short months, and every part of me ached to bring her into a world that felt stable, safe, sacred. But nothing felt sacred anymore, not after what Derek had done. Not after standing in a courtroom, listening to him try to minimize the moment he shoved me like it was some unfortunate misunderstanding. He didn't contact me directly. He couldn't, not legally. But his attempts still slithered through the cracks. Flowers arrived at my door, white roses, always white, like some twisted nod to peace. I tossed every bouquet in the trash. Cards came too, unsigned, but I knew his handwriting. One note said, "For Eliza, I hope someday you'll understand." Another said, "This isn't who I am." The hell it wasn't. I forwarded everything to Teresa. "Keep documenting," she said, "even the manipulations that feel subtle, especially those." But what really gutted me was what came next. Derek's mother, Gloria, called. Her voice was shaky on the line. "Madeline, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I didn't know what else to do. I said nothing. I want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what he did to you. To the baby. It's unforgivable. Please don't call the police. I laughed, bitter and sharp. You're asking me not to hold your son accountable? No, she whispered. I'm asking you to let us handle it. Harold can make sure you're taken care of financially, you and the baby. There it was. Hush money. I ended the call without another word. A few hours later, a check arrived via courier. I didn't even open the envelope, just shredded it and watched the pieces flutter into the bin like the last remnants of a lie I used to live inside. But what I couldn't shred, couldn't ignore, was the phone call that came a few nights later. This time it was Bianca. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, she said, her voice low and raspy with exhaustion. I didn't answer. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. I never thought it would end like this. I never thought he shoved you. In public, at my baby shower. My stomach twisted at the memory, but I let her talk. He told me your marriage was already over, that you were just living like roommates. I believed him. I was stupid. I wanted to yell, to say she wasn't just stupid, she was selfish, careless, complicit. But instead I said, then why are you calling? Because I'm leaving. I'm moving back to San Diego with my mom. I don't want to raise the twins in that mess. I thought you should know. There was a pause. And because I meant it, I'm sorry, Madeline, truly. I swallowed hard. If you care about what's best for your kids, don't let him near them. And don't let him convince you he's fixed just because he cries when he's cornered. I won't, she whispered. Goodbye. After the call, I stood in Eliza's room again. The same yellow crib. The same soft mobile spinning slowly above it. And I whispered something to her, my hand resting on the curve of my belly. I won't let him hurt you, baby girl, I swear it. Then came the court summons for the follow-up hearing. Teresa called me the next morning, voice clipped with tension. He's pushing for joint custody. Still. I stared out the window, my fingers tightening around the phone. The baby isn't even born. He knows that, but he's trying to secure his image early, paint himself as the involved, wronged father. It didn't surprise me. Derek was nothing if not strategic. He'd always known how to play the long game, how to twist things in his favor, how to flash sincerity like it was currency. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I wasn't the same woman anymore. The woman he married would have folded. The woman he lied to would have begged. But the woman who walked into that courtroom, bruised spine and all, she was fire. I agreed to the hearing. In the days leading up to it, I tried to center myself. I walked every morning, even when my ankles ached. I meditated. I sat in stillness. I drank peppermint tea and let Lucy read me chapters from the baby books I no longer had the energy to finish. You're going to be the kind of mom who scares bullies, she said one night, nudging my foot with hers. And I mean that in the best way. I smiled. Bullies like her father. Exactly. The day of the hearing, I wore navy blue. Not black, not mourning, not soft pastels either. Navy, strong, clear, unshakable. The courtroom was colder this time. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I'd finally gone numb. Teresa did most of the talking. She laid out every fact, every documented incident, the witnesses, the push, the hospital visit, the text messages, the affair, the twins. Then she said, my client is not seeking to deny Mr. Collins his rights. She is willing to consider co-parenting, but only under strict boundaries and with court supervision. She will not risk exposing her newborn to emotional instability or physical harm. Judge Martin nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Grant. Then she looked at me. Miss Hayes, is there anything you'd like to say directly? I stood, took a breath, felt Eliza kick just once, like she was reminding me she was there. I'm here for my daughter, I said. I don't want revenge. I'm not here out of spite. I'm here because I need to protect her. I believe every child deserves a father, but not at the expense of their safety or peace. I paused, and I will do whatever it takes to ensure she has both. Derek said nothing. He just looked at me, and for once, I couldn't read him. The judge recessed for deliberation. When she returned, her ruling was clear. Protective order extended, supervised visitation only, mandatory counseling for Derek, no overnight stays until further review post-birth. I exhaled. Finally. Afterward, as we walked toward the courthouse steps, Teresa turned to me. You did good, Madeline. I looked up at the sky, a pale winter blue. No, I said. I did what I had to. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. After the second court hearing, things quieted down, but not in the way peace settles after a storm. This was a different kind of quiet, like the eerie calm in the eye of a hurricane, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you know the damage isn't done. But for a while, it gave me room to breathe. And I needed that. I moved out of the apartment Derek and I once shared. Every wall in that place had absorbed too many lies. I couldn't walk past the front door without picturing the last time he came home late, shirt wrinkled, guilt oozing off him like cheap cologne. So I left. I found a small one-bedroom place across town. Nothing fancy, but cozy, tucked into a quiet neighborhood where the loudest sound was the breeze through jacaranda trees. Lucy helped me move in. She unpacked my kitchen while I sat on the couch, too tired to do anything but stare at the floor and feel Eliza flutter in my belly like she was adjusting to the change with me. The nursery was small, just enough room for a crib, a rocking chair, and a shelf I filled with children's books and stuffed animals from friends who wanted me to remember there was still sweetness in the world. I chose lavender as the color scheme, not pink. I didn't want Eliza growing up thinking softness was her only value. Lavender was gentler, yes, but still bold enough to make a statement. I hoped she would be too. I changed my phone number, blocked Derek from every possible avenue. Teresa had made it clear, all communication had to go through legal channels. And thank God for that. Because even with the protective order, I knew he'd find some way to worm himself into my space if given the chance. I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to read another apology typed in the middle of the night when guilt made his hands shake. I didn't want closure. I wanted distance. Bianca moved back to San Diego with her mother and the twins. She kept her promise. She didn't reach out except for short, emotionless updates. Just enough to keep the air between us from growing sour again. The twins were doing well, gaining weight, smiling, hitting milestones. Her messages were never signed with warmth, but there was a certain softness underneath them, like she knew she didn't have the right to ask for more, but still wanted me to know she was trying. And I appreciated that, quietly, from afar. Derek, meanwhile, began attending his court-mandated anger management classes. I knew because Harold, his father, sent periodic legal updates through Teresa. Sterile, professional, clinical. Just enough to say, see, he's cooperating. I didn't care. Let him jump through all the hoops he wanted. That didn't make him safe. There were days I still woke up from dreams where I was back at that baby shower, only this time the shove was harder, and Eliza didn't kick afterward. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, clutching my belly, whispering, "You're okay, baby. You're okay." Some scars weren't visible. Some healed in whispers and slow exhales, not stitches. Therapy helped. I met with a woman named Dr. Karen Rhodes twice a week. She had kind eyes and a voice that could soften concrete. She never rushed me, never tried to fix me. She let me talk in circles until I realized I was telling the same story over and over again, not because I couldn't move on, but because I still needed to understand how I ever let it happen in the first place. "It's not about what you allowed," she said once. "It's about what you believed you deserved." And that belief, it's changing now, isn't it? It was. I started taking walks in the morning, slow, careful steps through the neighborhood, Eliza's weight shifting gently as I moved. People would smile at me, nod, say things like, "Any day now, huh?" And I'd smile back, hiding the layers underneath. They didn't need to know that my child's father had once tried to erase me in public. They didn't need to know that I was rebuilding a life from splinters. All they saw was a pregnant woman about to begin a new chapter, and maybe in some small way they were right. Then, one afternoon, I came home from a prenatal appointment and found Derek sitting in the lobby of my building. My heart dropped. He looked tired, gaunt. The suit he wore was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. There were shadows under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly when he stood. I froze. "You're violating the order," I said, already backing toward the door. "You need to leave." "I know," he said quickly, holding his hands up like I was a cornered animal. "I know I shouldn't be here. I needed to see you, just for a minute." My chest tightened. I glanced around, hoping someone from the front office might intervene, but the desk was empty. Typical. "I've been in therapy," he added, voice low. Real therapy, not just the court-ordered stuff. I'm trying, Madeline. You should have gone through Teresa, I snapped. This is not okay. I know. He lowered his gaze. I'm leaving LA, moving to San Francisco, staying with a cousin. I just wanted to tell you in person, and to ask, do you need anything? For the baby, money, supplies, anything. The sincerity in his voice was unfamiliar, not smooth, not rehearsed, just tired. I paused. If you're really sorry, I said, you'll respect the boundaries we fought for. You'll send child support through legal channels, and you'll stay away until Eliza's safety isn't a question. He nodded. I will. I needed to say it one last time. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just watched him go. And when the door closed behind him, I let myself exhale. In the weeks that followed, I prepared for Eliza like it was the only thing that mattered, because it was. Lucy flew in again to help. We stocked the apartment with diapers and onesies, prepped the hospital bag, and hung soft curtains in the nursery. We didn't talk much about Derek, not anymore. He'd become background noise in a life I was trying to make joyful again. One morning, I woke up to the first real contraction. I called Lucy. She was there in 15 minutes, already dressed and holding my hand like she'd trained for it her whole life. The drive to the hospital was short, surreal. Between contractions, I remember staring out the window at the city passing by and thinking, this is it. Everything starts now. 12 hours later, Eliza Rose entered the world. Red-faced and wailing and perfect. I held her against my chest and cried so hard I could barely breathe. Not from pain, but from relief. From love. From the overwhelming realization that after everything, after all the courtrooms and betrayals and bruises, something good had finally arrived. Lucy cut the umbilical cord with tears in her eyes. Teresa stopped by the next day with flowers and a plush bunny, smiling like she'd just won her favorite case. She's perfect, she whispered. I looked at Eliza, her tiny fists curled, her breathing soft and even, and said, she's the beginning of everything. And she was. The weeks after Eliza's birth unfolded like a sunrise after a sleepless night. Quiet, tender, and tentative. My body was healing, but my heart was still figuring out what it meant to finally have her in my arms. There were moments when the exhaustion was so thick I thought I might dissolve into the crib with her, but then she'd stretch, yawn, or blink up at me with those dark, wondering eyes. And I'd remember why I chose to fight through every nightmare. I'd spend hours just watching her sleep. The soft rise and fall of her chest, the tiny squeaks she made mid-dream, the way her fingers curled around mine as if she already knew this world could be uncertain, and I was the one thing she could trust. Those early days were hard. Beautiful, but hard. The loneliness came in waves. When Lucy flew back to Ohio, when the apartment was too quiet, when I had no one to share a particularly adorable coo or hiccup with. But it was also peaceful. There was no more walking on eggshells. No pretending everything was okay while my world cracked underfoot. It was just me and Eliza, finding a rhythm. I paused my design work temporarily, only taking on small freelance gigs I could do from home. A young couple down the street hired me to help redecorate their nursery, and I found solace in it. There was something healing about painting new beginnings for other families, even as I was learning to navigate my own. Derek, I mean. It took me a while to stop calling him Carter in my head, as if he still belonged to me somehow. Derek kept his distance. He sent monthly payments through the escrow account Teresa set up. They arrived on time, with no notes, no drama. A part of me expected more, that he'd try to break the silence, press against the court-ordered boundaries with another letter or voicemail. But he didn't. Not after that final visit in the lobby. Instead, Harold occasionally emailed updates about Derek's therapy progress. I never responded, but I read them. I read them the way you'd read a newspaper article about someone you used to know, detached, but not entirely indifferent. According to Harold, Derek was doing everything by the book, attending sessions, cooperating, staying in San Francisco. He was, apparently, working on himself. I didn't know if it was real change or just guilt management. I didn't care to find out. Not yet. Bianca, meanwhile, sent sparse, polite updates about the twins. They were hitting milestones, sitting up, babbling, grabbing everything within reach. She even sent a photo once. 2 babies with toothless grins, side by side in a playpen, wearing matching onesies that said, Mama's Boys. I stared at that photo for a long time. There was no bitterness in her message, no apology, no expectation. Just, they turned 6 months today. Thought you might want to see them. And I did. But not because I felt anything for them, not the way a mother might. I felt something else. A strange kind of peace. Not forgiveness exactly. Just a letting go. The bitterness was exhausting. I didn't want to keep feeding it. One evening, while Eliza napped on my chest, I opened a shoebox I had stuffed in the back of my closet. Inside were the letters Derek had written after the baby shower, some handwritten, others typed, all unopened until now. I read one. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't manipulative. It was tired, raw, rambling. He wrote about how he never understood what real love looked like, how he thought being a good provider would be enough, how he chased admiration like it could replace intimacy. He wrote about Bianca, about how it started as an escape and turned into a prison. He wrote that he never expected to become a father to 3 children at once, and how terrified he was that he'd ruin them all. But mostly, he wrote about me. I see now what I did to you, he wrote, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll let me show our daughter who I'm trying to become. I closed the letter and didn't open another. Not yet. Eliza deserved a father. But she didn't need a broken one bleeding all over her life. Not until he was steady. And I didn't trust Derek to be steady, not because he was trying, but because he was trying now, when it was already too late for me. Still, I told Teresa that I'd be willing to consider a supervised visit when Eliza turned 2. If Derek remained in therapy, if he kept up with child support, if every report we received over the next year was clean. That was the boundary I set. Not for him, but for myself. A line that protected my peace. Teresa nodded. We'll draft the conditional agreement. No promises, just possibilities. I agreed. Bianca reached out one last time, thanking me for the space I'd allowed. She told me she was continuing her legal studies online, that the twins were enrolled in an early learning program. We're okay, she wrote. It's not the life I imagined either, but we're okay. I wished her well. I meant it. The old me might have held on to that betrayal forever. She would have carried it like armor, worn it like proof. But I wasn't her anymore. I didn't want to be. Eliza was 8 months old when she took her first step between the couch and the coffee table. Her balance was shaky, her mouth open in glee, and I was on my knees with tears in my eyes. I clapped and cheered and scooped her up in my arms, spinning her in the air until we were both laughing. That night, after she went down to sleep, I sat by her crib and whispered, "You are joy. You are light. You are mine." And that was enough. The life I had now wasn't what I planned. It wasn't the dream I envisioned when I stood in that white dress under strings of lights, believing a man's promises. But it was real, honest, built from ash and softness, from bruises and lullabies. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. One day, Eliza might ask why her father didn't live with us, why we had court papers and supervised visits and stories I didn't always want to tell. When that day comes, I'll tell her the truth. Gently, lovingly. I'll tell her that love should never hurt. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Not because you're weak, but because you finally understand your worth. And I'll tell her that she was never born into a broken family. She was born into a rebuilding one. And we rebuilt something beautiful. Eliza's first birthday arrived on a soft spring morning, the kind where the air smells faintly of blooming jasmine and everything feels like a beginning. I woke up before she did, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table just watching the light move across the floor. 1 year. It had been 1 full year since the day she changed my life forever, the day she came into the world screaming like she had something to prove. And maybe she did. Maybe we both did. We celebrated with a small gathering in the park near our apartment, nothing extravagant. Just a few friends, some new moms from the support group, Lucy, who flew in, of course, and a picnic table covered in pastel cupcakes and balloons. I kept the guest list light on purpose. I didn't want the day to be about everything we had survived. I wanted it to be about Eliza, her laughter, her wobbling steps, her love of smashing cake with both fists. She wore a little yellow dress with sunflowers on it, a headband she kept trying to yank off, and a smile that made everything else disappear. When she clapped her hands as we sang "Happy Birthday," I felt something in my chest crack open. Not pain this time, but something close to grace. a deep, quiet joy. Bianca sent a text that morning. "Happy birthday, Eliza. I hope today is filled with love." No photos, no emojis. Just the words. I stared at the message for a moment before replying, "Thank you." That was it. Simple, civil, and somehow enough. Derek didn't come. He didn't ask to. Maybe he knew he wasn't ready. Maybe he finally understood what accountability looked like. Not just showing up, but staying gone until invited back in. Harold had emailed Teresa a few weeks earlier, informing her that Derek was still in therapy, still sending child support on time, still hoping that one day, a path to connection might open. I hadn't made any decisions yet. I didn't need to. Eliza was still too young to understand the full story, but I had a plan. When the time came, maybe when she turned 5, maybe later, we'd revisit it. If Derek kept doing the work, if the reports continued to show growth and change, I'd allow a supervised meeting. 1. Carefully monitored, on my terms. For her, not for him. But that future was still a dot on the horizon. Today, there were cupcakes to eat and bubbles to chase. Lucy blew soap bubbles through a plastic wand, and Eliza ran toward them, shrieking with delight, her arms outstretched as if she could catch the whole sky. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and Eliza had finally fallen asleep with frosting still in the folds of her neck, I sat down with a pen and paper and wrote her a letter. I didn't intend to, not at first. But something about the day, the quietness of it, the completeness, it made me want to put something into words that she could read when she was older. I started like this. "Dear Eliza, today you turned 1. You won't remember the party, or the sun, or how your fingers turned blue from smooshing a blueberry cupcake. You won't remember the way Lucy laughed when you chased after a butterfly like you thought it might be a balloon. But I will. I will remember everything. Because this day wasn't just about your first year. It was about mine too. I wrote about how scared I'd been, about how strong she made me, about how her tiny cries stitched something back together inside me that I thought was permanently torn. I didn't write about Derek. Not yet. Not directly. But I did write this. You will grow up knowing that love is safe, that it doesn't lie, that it doesn't push or hide or ask you to shrink. You will grow up surrounded by people who show up for you, not with words, but with actions. And if you ever doubt your worth, I want you to remember this. You were born into a storm, but you are not the storm. You are the calm that followed it. I folded the letter and placed it in a keepsake box along with her hospital bracelet, the first sonogram photo, and the pacifier she refused to use, but always liked to chew on. Then I stood by her crib and watched her sleep, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted in dreams. I rested my hand lightly on her back and whispered, "You'll never have to wonder if you're loved." And I meant it. Not long after, I reopened my design business full-time. Word of mouth had spread about the quiet strength in my style, clean lines, warm textures, and a focus on reclaimed beauty. Clients didn't know the full story, but they responded to something in the work. A sense of resilience, maybe, or transformation. My waiting list grew, my confidence returned. Eliza became the heartbeat of our home. Her first word was "Mama," spoken one morning while she sat in her high chair, pointing at me with sticky fingers and eyes full of wonder. I dropped the spoon I was holding and cried right there on the kitchen floor. Every day brought something new, a giggle I hadn't heard before, a dance she made up on the spot, a tantrum that reminded me she was her own person, fire and all. And I cherished it. Even the hard moments. Especially those. Because I had learned something crucial during that long, painful year. The opposite of betrayal isn't revenge. It's clarity. And with that clarity came peace. Derek kept his distance. Occasionally, Teresa would relay an update. He was still in therapy. He'd gotten a stable job in San Francisco. He hadn't missed a single payment. But I didn't engage. I didn't encourage. I let the silence do what words never could. Rebuild the boundaries. Bianca sent one last message when the twins turned 1. She included a photo, 2 chubby toddlers with frosting on their faces and party hats sliding off their heads. "Thank you," she wrote, "for letting the past be the past." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. Lucy continued to be my lifeline, calling often, sending memes and late-night messages when motherhood felt lonely or overwhelming. Sometimes we'd joke about our past selves, young, wide-eyed, hopelessly in love with the idea of men who didn't know what to do with women like us. "You've done more than survive, Maddie," she said one evening. "You've built something beautiful." And she was right. One night, as I stood by the window, Eliza curled against my chest. I watched the city lights blink in the distance and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not emptiness. Not silence. Stillness. Peace. The scars were still there, emotional and otherwise. But they no longer dictated the story. They were just part of the landscape, reminders of where I'd been, not warnings of where I was going. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Derek would ever be ready, or if Eliza would ever want to know him. But I did know this: she would never have to wonder who stood in her corner, who loved her first, who loved her most. She would always know that she was enough. And so was I. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Madeline's journey spoke to your heart, and for that, I'm truly grateful. This story isn't just about betrayal or heartbreak. It's about rising from the ashes of what you thought your life would be and building something even stronger, even more beautiful. It's about learning that love should never cost your peace, and strength often looks like walking away, not in anger, but in dignity. Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you're standing at the edge of your own turning point. Whatever brought you here, I hope this reminded you of one simple truth: you are enough. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? What part of the world do you call home? If this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got more powerful, real, and raw stories coming your way. Because everyone deserves to feel seen, heard, and reminded that even in the darkest chapters, hope can still turn the page. Until next time, take care, and never settle for less than the love you deserve.